Chapter 9. Personal Treatment. I have nothing cruel or shocking to relate to my own personal experiences while I remained upon Colonel Lloyd's plantation, at the home of my old master. An occasional cuff from Aunt Caddy and a regular whipping from old master, such as any heedless and mischievous boy might get from his father, is all that I can mention of this sort. I was not old enough to work upon the fields, and there being little else than field work to perform, I had much leisure. The most I had to do was to drive up the cows in the evening, to keep the front yard clean, and to perform the small errands of my young mistress, Lucetta Old. I have reasons for thinking this lady was very kindly disposed towards me, and although I was not often the object of her affection, I constantly regarded her as my friend, and was always glad when it was my privilege to do her service. In a family where there was much that was harsh, cold, and indifferent, the slightest word or look of kindness passed with me for its full value. Miss Lucretta, as we all continued to call her long after her marriage, had bestowed upon me such words and looks as taught me that she pitied me, if she did not love me. In addition to words and looks, she sometimes gave me a piece of bread and butter, a thing not set down upon the bill of fare, and which must have been an extra ration, planned aside from either Aunt Caddy or the old master, solely out of the tender regard and friendship that she had for me. Then, too, I had one day got into the wars with Uncle Abe's son Ike, and had got sadly worsted. In fact, the little rascal had struck me directly upon the forehead with a sharp piece of cinder, fused with iron, and from the old blacksmith's forge, which made a cross upon my forehead very plainly to see even now. The gash bled very freely, and I roared very loudly and betook myself home. The cold-hearted Aunt Caddy paid no attention either to my wound or to my roaring, except to tell me that it served me right. I had no business with Ike. It was good for me. I could now keep away from them Lloyd blackers. Miss Lucretta, in this state of the case, came forward, and in quite a different spirit from the manifest of Aunt Caddy, she called me into the parlor, an extra privilege of itself, and without using toward me any of the hard-hearted and reproachful efforts of my kitchen tormentor, she quietly acted the good Samaritan. With her own soft hand she washed the blood from my head and my face, fetched her own balsam bottle, and with balsam wetted a nice piece of white linen, and bound up my head. The balsam was not more healing to the wound in my head than her kindness was healing to the wounds upon my spirit, made by the unfeeling words of Aunt Caddy. After this, Miss Lucretta was my friend. I felt her to be such, and I have no doubt that the simple act of binding up my head did much to awaken in her an interest in my welfare. It is quite true that this interest was never very marked, and it seldom showed itself in anything more than in giving me a piece of bread when I was hungry. But this was a great favor upon a slave plantation, and I was the only one of the children to whom such attention was paid. When very hungry, I would go into the backyard and play under Miss Lucretta's window. When pretty severely pinched by hunger, I had a habit of singing, which the good lady very soon came to understand was a petition for a piece of bread. When I sung under Miss Lucretta's window, I was very apt to get well paid for my music. The reader will see that I now had two friends, both in important parts, Master Daniel at the great house, and Miss Lucretta at home. From Master Daniel I got protection from the bigger boys, and from Miss Lucretta I got bread, by singing when I was hungry, and sympathy when I was abused by that termagant, who had the reins of government upon the kitchen. For such friendship I felt deeply grateful, and bitter as are my recollections of slavery. I love to recall any instances of kindness, any sunbeams of the human treatment, which found a way to my soul through the iron grating of my house of bondage. Such beams seem all the brighter from the general darkness into which they penetrate, and the impression they make is vividly distinct and quite beautiful. As I have before intimated, I was seldom whipped, and never severely, by my old master. I suffered personally little from the treatment I received, except for hunger and cold. These were my two great physical troubles. I could neither ever get sufficient food nor clothing, but I suffered less from hunger than from cold. In the hottest summer and the coldest winter, I was kept almost in a state of nudity. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing but the coarse sackcloth of towel linen, made into some sort of shirt, reaching down to my knees. This I wore night and day, changing it but once a week, and in the daytime I could protect myself pretty well by keeping upon the sunny side of the house, but in bad weather in the corner of the kitchen chimney. The great difficulty was to keep warm during night. I had no bed. The pigs in the pen had leaves, and the horses in the stable had straw, but the children had no beds. They lodged anywhere in the ample kitchen. I slept generally in a little closet, without even a blanket to cover me. In very cold weather I sometimes got down the bag in which the cornmeal was usually carried to the mill, and I crawled into that. Sleeping there with my head in and feet out, I was partially protected, though not comfortable. My feet had been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might even be laid within the gashes. The manner of taking our meals at old master's indicated but little refinement. Our cornmeal mush, when sufficiently cooled, was placed upon a large wooden tray, or trough, like those used in the making of maple sugar here in the north. This tray was set down either upon the floor of the kitchen, or out of the doors upon the ground, and the children were called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs we would come, and literally devour the mush, some with oyster shells, some with pieces of shingle, and none with spoons. He that eat the fastest got the most, and he that was the strongest got the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. I was the most unlucky of any, for Aunt Caddy had no good feeling for me, and if I pushed any of the other children, or if they told her anything unfavorable of me, she always believed the worst, and was sure to whip me. As I grew older and more thoughtful, I was more and more filled with a sense of my wretchedness, the cruelty of Aunt Caddy, and the hunger and cold that I suffered. The terrible reports of wrong and outrage which came to my ear, together with what I most daily witnessed, led me, when yet but 8 or 9 years old, to wish I had never been born. I used to contrast my condition with the blackbirds, in whose wild and sweet songs I fancied them so happy. Their apparent joy only deepened the shades of my own sorrow. They were thoughtful days in the lives of children, at least they were in mine, when they grapple with all the great primary subjects of knowledge, and reach in a moment conclusions which no subsequent experience can shake. I was just as well aware of the unjust, unnatural, and murderous character of slavery, when 9 years old, as I am now. Without any appeal to books, to laws, or to authorities of any kind, it was enough to accept God as a father, and to regard slavery as a crime. I was not yet 10 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation for Baltimore. I left that plantation with an inexpressible joy. I never shall forget the ecstasy in which I received the intelligence from my friend, Miss Lucretta, that my old master had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Old, a brother to Mr. Thomas Old, my old master's son-in-law. I received this information about 3 days before my departure. They were 3 of the happiest days of my childhood. I spent the largest part of these 3 days upon the creek, washing off the plantation scruff, and preparing for my new home. Miss Lucretta took a lively interest in getting me ready. She told me I must get all the dead skin off of my feet and knees before I could go to Baltimore, for the people there were very cleanly, and would laugh at me if I looked dirty, and besides she was intending to give me a pair of trousers, which I should not put on unless I got the dirt off. This was a warning to which I was bound to take heed, for the thought of owning a pair of trousers was great indeed. It was almost a sufficient motive, not only to introduce me to scrub off the mang, as pig drivers would call it, but the skin as well. So I went at it in good earnest, working for the first time in the hope of reward. I was greatly excited, and could hardly consent to sleep, lest I should be left. The ties that ordinarily bind children to their homes were all well severed, or they never had any existence in my case, at least so far as the home plantation of Colonel Lloyd was concerned. I therefore found no severe trail at the moment of my departure, such as I had experienced when separated from my home in Tuckahoe. My home at old master's was a charmless to me, for it was not a home, but a prison. Only parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything which I could have enjoyed by staying. My mother was dead, my grandmother was far away, so that I seldom ever saw her, and Aunt Candy was my unrelenting tormentor. My 2 sisters and brothers, owing to our early separation in life, and the family-destroying power of slavery, were strangers to me, and the fact of our relationship was almost blotted out. I looked for home elsewhere, and was confident of finding none which I should relish less than the one I was leaving. If, however, I found in my new home to which I was going, with such blissful anticipations hardship, whipping, and nakedness, I had the questionable consultation that I should not have escaped any of these evils by remaining under the management of Aunt Caddy. Then, too, I thought, since I had endured much in this line on Lloyd's plantation, I could endure as much elsewhere, and especially at Baltimore, for I had something of the feeling about the city which is expressed upon the saying that being hanged in England is better than dying a natural death in Ireland. I had the strongest desire to see Baltimore. My cousin Tom, a boy 2 or 3 older than I, had been there, and though not fluent, he stuttered most immoderately in speech. He had inspired me with that desire by his eloquent description of the place. Tom was sometimes Captain Auld's cabin boy, and when he came from Baltimore, he was always a sort of hero amongst us, at least till his Baltimore trip was forgotten. I could never tell him of anything, or point out anything that struck me as beautiful or powerful, but he had seen something in Baltimore far surpassing it. Even the great house itself, with all its pictures within and pillars without, he had the hardihood to say, was nothing compared to Baltimore. He bought a trumpet worth 6 pence and brought it home, told what he had seen in the windows of stores, that he had heard shooting crackers, seen soldiers, seen a steamboat, and that there were ships in Baltimore that could carry 4 such sloops as the Sally Lloyd. He had said a great deal about the market house. He spoke of the bells a-ringing, and of many other things which roused my curiosity very much, and indeed which heightened my hopes of happiness upon my new home. We sailed out of Miles River for Baltimore early on a Saturday morning. I remembered only the day of the week, for at that time I had no knowledge of the days of the month, nor indeed that there were months of the year. On setting sail, I walked aft, and gave to Colonel Lloyd's plantation what I hoped would be the last look I should ever give to it, or to any place like it. My strong aversion to that great farm was not owing to my own personal suffering, but the daily suffering of others, and to the certainty that I must sooner or later be placed under the barbarous rule of an overseer, such as the accomplished Gore or the brutal and drunken plumber. After taking this last visit, I quitted the deck, made my way to the bow of the sloop, and spent the remainder of the day looking ahead, interesting myself in what was in the distance, rather than what was near or behind. The vessels sweeping along the bay were very interesting objects. The broad bay opened like a shoreless ocean in my boyish vision, filling me with the wonder and admiration. Late in that afternoon we reached Annapolis, the capital of the state, stopping there not long enough to admit of my going ashore. It was the first large town I had ever seen, and though it was inferior to many factory village in New England, my feelings on seeing it were excited to a pitch very little below that reached by travelers upon the first view of Rome. The dome of the State House was especially imposing, and surpassed in grandeur the appearance of the great house. The great world was opening upon me very rapidly, and I was eagerly acquainting myself with its multifarious lessons. We arrived upon Baltimore on Sunday morning, and landed at Smith's Wharf, not far from Bowley's Wharf. We had on board the sloop a large flock of sheep for the Baltimore market, and after assisting in driving them to the slaughter-house of a Mr. Curtis on London's Slater's Hill, I was speedily conducted by Rich, one of the hands belonging to the sloop, to my new home in Alacon Street, near Gardner's shipyard on Fell's Point. Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Gould, my new mistress and master, were both at home, and they met me at the door with their rosy-cheeked little son, Thomas, to take care of whom was to constitute my future occupation. In fact, it was to little Tommy, rather than to his parents, that the old master had made a present of me, and though there was no legal form or arrangement entered into, I have no doubt that Mr. and Mrs. Auld felt that in due time I would be the legal property of their bright-eyed and beloved boy, Tommy. I was struck with their appearance, especially my new mistress, for her face was lighted with the kindliest of emotions, and the reflex influence of her countenance, as well as the tenderness with which she seemed to regard me, while asking me the sundry little questions, greatly delighted me, and lit up to my fancy the pathway of my future. Miss Lucretta was kind, but my new mistress, Miss Sophia, surpassed her in kindness of manner. Little Thomas was affectionately told by his mother that there was his Freddie, and that Freddie would take care of him. I was told to be kind to little Tommy, an injunction I scarcely needed, for I had already fallen in love with the dear boy, and with these little ceremonies I was initiated into my new home, and entered upon my peculiar duties with not a cloud above the horizon. I may say here that I regarded my removal from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting and fortunate events of my life. Viewing it in the light of human likelihoods, it is quite probable that but for the mere circumstance of being thus removed before the rigors of slavery had fastened upon me, before my young spirit had been crushed upon the iron control of the slave-driver, instead of being today a freeman, I might have been wearing the galling chains of slavery. I have sometimes felt, however, that there was something more intelligent than simple chance, and something more certain than blind luck, to be seen upon the circumstance. If I have made any progress in knowledge, if I have cherished any honorable aspirations, or have in any manner worthily discharged the duties of a member of an oppressed people, this little circumstance must be allowed its due weight in giving my life that direction. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that divinity that shapes our ends, and rough hew them as we will. I was not the only boy upon the plantation that might have been sent to live in Baltimore. There was a wide margin from which to select. There were boys younger, boys older, boys of the same age, belonging to my old master, and some at his own house, and some at his farm, but the high privilege fell upon my lot. I may be deemed superstitious, and I may be deemed egotistical, in regarding this event as a special interposition of divine providence upon my favor, but the thought is a part of my history, and I should be false to the earliest and most cherished sentiments of my soul if I suppressed or hesitated to avow that opinion, although it may be characterized as irrational by the wise and ridiculous by the scoffer. From my earliest recollections of serious matters, I date the entertainment of something like an ineffaceable conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And this conviction, like a word of living faith, strengthened me through the darkest trials of my lot. This good spirit was from God, and to Him I offer thanksgiving and praise.